I'm Caleb with YouCanMakeThisToo. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be doing a small gift box that I made for a friend with help from another friend, Bruce Ulrich. He did some laser work for me on the top that I filled in with epoxy. But stick with me and I'll show you how you can make this too.
This is going to be a simple quick build, and the router table that I built a few projects ago is going to make it a lot easier. I'll put up a link to that in case you're interested. So off camera, I milled down some white oak to around 1/2 inch thick, and now if you don't have milling machines, you can normally pick up 1/2 inch lumber from the big home centers. The first thing I did was break the lumber down to the dimensions I needed by ripping it on the table saw and then cutting it to length at my miter saw station. But both of these steps could be performed with a circular saw and a straight edge. Definitely don't need big machines for this project. As for joinery, I'm going with finger joints at my router table because it's still new and exciting for me to use it. Finger joints are also easily done with a router jig or at the table saw with the simple table saw jig. Finger joints work great on thin stock because the fingers create a lot more glue surface while still being pretty quick to cut and not requiring any reinforcement. Off camera, before I started cutting the finger joints on the box pieces, I used several scraps to get my jig and router bit height set correctly. As always when working with machines, test cuts are how to get good results. But nevertheless, I went ahead and did a dry fit of all the pieces before gluing up, just to make sure everything fit well. Now, I didn't want a hot mess of glue everywhere, so I used an acid brush to lightly spread a coat of glue on one joint at a time, and then put them together while the glue was still wet. Once all four corners were kind of together, I put clamps on to squeeze it home. I made sure to use multiple clamps at a time to apply a more even pressure across the boards. If I tried just a single clamp in the middle, I was afraid I might end up cracking the thin boards instead of pushing them together. And then I used the straw trick to clean out the little bit of glue squeeze out that was inside the box. After it was clamped up, I checked with a square to make sure everything was square, and it was. Another nice thing about box joints is if your lumber is good and flat, once it's clamped up properly, they tend to come out square or at least really close to it. Now I cut the fingers a little more proud than they needed to be, so instead of flushing them up with a random orbit sander, I started at my belt sander with a 100 grit belt. That's aggressive enough to remove waste pretty quickly, but not so aggressive that I'm gonna get in trouble if it gets away from me. Now white oak tends to be a really splintery wood, and I did have some splintering when I cut the joints, so I used some wood putty to fill in any bits before sanding everything down off camera. Now it's time to put a bottom in the box. I opted for plywood because it's very stable and shouldn't expand and then put pressure on the box sides. I also don't want the bottom visible, so I cut a rabbet on the inside in 2 passes at the router table. The second pass was just a hair deeper than the plywood is thick, so that way the box will rest on the bottom of the sides and not the plywood, which is just going to help it sit better on wherever it gets placed. Instead of squaring the corners of the rabbet, I decided to use my corner radius jig and round the corners of the plywood. My rabbeting bit is a 1 1/4 inch diameter, so I used the 1 1/4 inch radius, and you probably figured out already that it didn't fit. I forgot that the radius is half of the diameter, so I cut another bottom piece, and this time I used the correct 5/8 radius guide and a flush trim bit. All it took was a little light sanding after that, and it fit great before I glued it in. And if you've been following along closely, you'll know this box still doesn't have a top. That's where my buddy Bruce, his links are below, comes in. Fortunately, he had some similarly toned white oak, so he milled it up and glued up a panel for me.
Hey, I'm Bruce, and you can make your friends make this too. No, but really, Caleb is my buddy. He asked that I help him with my laser engraver, and rather than him shipping me a piece of white oak, I decided I already had some white oak, shot him some pictures. He said, yeah, that would work great for the box I'm making. So I'm gluing up a panel so that it is wide enough for what he needed, and then I'm going to take it upstairs to the laser engraver.
The laser engraving looks great, but in the time that it's been in my shop, it's already turned into a bit of a dust catch, and because the white oak is a little splintery, it's really hard to keep it clean in there. So I decided an epoxy fill would be best. I whipped up some 1-to-1 epoxy and add some natural eyeliner as a dark tint. the eyeliner is a tip I picked up from Peter Brown. An eyeliner sampler is a great way to get a cheap variety of tinting colors, and is normally made from the same stuff as the actual tints for epoxy. This is a fairly delicate pour, and I wanted to make sure the epoxy really got into the engraving. So I used a craft stick to drizzle it in and then kind of spread it into the engraving. And then I came back with a toothpick and used it to help release the air trapped in the bottom of some of the letters, and that worked really well. I gave it some time and then came back with a heat gun to pop the air bubbles that had come to the surface. You don't need a lot of heat here. The idea is to just get the air to warm up and then expand enough to break the surface tension of the epoxy. If you use too much heat, you can affect the cure of the epoxy. After the epoxy cured, I came back with the heat gun to warm up the top layer to make chiseling it off go a bit easier. The stops in my T-track on this workbench made holding the piece still while I did this really easy. Then I ran through the grits on the top with my random orbit sander. We're going to zip back in time a bit to before I glued the bottom on. I centered the writing of the top where I thought it would look best in the box, and then used the box to mark out where it needed to be cut to fit. The miter saw made quick work of bringing it down to size. And I'm going to cut a rabbet on the underside of the lid so it'll stay on the box. I used the box again to mark how far in the rabbet needed to be before ripping it on my table saw. This could have been done with a lot of other tools, but I still had the ripping blade in my table saw and thought that would just be the fastest. After I made all the cuts that I could safely make on the table saw, I just used a chisel and shoulder plane to clean up the rabbet. The last step before finishing is polishing the epoxy. For that, I like to use the micromesh kits and wet sand it. I'll have a link below to these kits. A quick run through the grits and the epoxy always looks great. For finish, I used 3 coats of General Finishes Armor Seal and lightly sanded between coats with 400 grit paper. And with that, the box was done. Thank you for watching.